The city was alive with the hum of cars, voices, and the soft glow of dawn painting the sky in orange and pink. Amid the busy sidewalks, a small brown dog pushed through the crowd, its paws beating the pavement with urgency. Its tail wagged frantically, yet its eyes were filled with desperation. At the corner of Maple Avenue, Officer Karen Mitchell stood sipping her morning coffee. Known for her sharp instincts and calm heart, she scanned the street out of habit. Then, without warning, the dog bolted straight toward her. It barked in frantic bursts, its body trembling as if carrying a secret it could not speak. Karen bent down, extending her hand, her voice steady and soft. The dog did not calm. Instead, it tugged at her pant leg and ran ahead a few steps, looking back at her with a pleading gaze. Something inside Karen told her this was not ordinary. Her instincts sharpened, and her curiosity urged her forward. She gestured subtly to her partner in the patrol car, signaling caution, then followed the dog into a narrow alley. The city's sound faded behind her, replaced by an unsettling quiet. At the far end stood the skeletal frame of an abandoned construction site. The dog stopped at a rusted gate, barking and scratching at the dirt. Karen's eyes narrowed as she noticed a faint red trail winding inside. It was blood. Her chest tightened. She reached for her radio, her voice firm as she called for backup. What lay beyond that gate would be no simple accident. It was the beginning of something far larger than she could imagine. Karen pushed through the rusted gate, her boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The construction site stretched out before her like a graveyard of unfinished dreams, beams of steel rising like skeletons against the pale sky. The faint trail of blood cut across the uneven ground, weaving between piles of debris and overgrown weed. The dog trotted ahead with determination, pausing now and then to glance back at her as if to say, "Hurry." Its tail no longer wagged wildly, but stiffened, pointing like an arrow toward danger. Every step heightened Karen's senses. The clang of loose metal in the wind, the creak of wood shifting in the distance, all of it pressed down on her nerves. She let her hand rest on her holster, ready for the worst. The dog suddenly barked sharply and ran toward a stack of wooden planks leaning against a half-finished wall. Karen followed quickly, her eyes scanning every shadow. Then she saw it, a small hand protruding from beneath the planks, limp and pale against the dust. Her heart jolted. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees. The fingers twitched weakly, a fragile sign of life. Adrenaline surged through her veins. Karen raised her radio, her voice steady but urgent as she called for immediate medical backup. She began lifting the lighter pieces of wood, careful not to cause further harm. The dog paced in circles nearby, its whimpers echoing like a cry for urgency. Beneath the debris lay a young boy, no older than 8. His face was smeared with dirt, his breaths shallow. His eyes fluttered open just enough to meet hers. Relief washed over Karen, but with it came the heavy weight of dread. She was no longer dealing with a routine call. Something much darker had dragged this child into danger. Karen brushed dirt from the boy's face, keeping her voice calm and steady as she checked his breathing. His lips trembled, his body shaking with exhaustion. He whispered a single word that made her blood run cold. "Bad men." The words were faint, almost lost in the noise of the wind, but Karen caught them. She leaned closer, urging him to stay awake. The boy's name, she learned in a fragile murmur, was Leo. He had been hiding when the wood collapsed on him. Karen assured him that help was on the way, though her own pulse hammered with unease. Who were these men he spoke of, and why would they chase a child through an abandoned construction site? Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as backup and medical teams neared. But even with help on the way, Karen knew every second mattered. She continued clearing the debris until paramedics rushed in, carefully lifting Leo onto a stretcher. His tiny hand clutched hers for a moment, as though he feared she might vanish if he let go. The dog stood nearby, tail low, eyes locked on Karen as if waiting for her to notice something else. Then, with sudden urgency, it barked again, turning toward another pile of rubble. Karen's instincts sharpened. She had already found one child. What else could be hidden here? With steady steps, she followed the dog to the spot it had chosen, her chest tightening as she prepared herself for what she might uncover next. Karen crouched beside the rubble where the dog barked furiously. She pushed aside a bent sheet of corrugated metal, revealing a worn backpack buried beneath dust and broken wood. The fabric was scuffed, the zippers half torn, but it had clearly been hidden with care. She opened it cautiously. Inside lay a small water bottle, a few snacks, and a notebook covered in smudges of dirt. She flipped through its pages, her heart tightening at what she saw. Crayon drawings of a family. Father, mother, and a little boy who looked strikingly like Leo. Each picture told a story of love, but also of absence, the father often fading into the background as though missing from the child's world. On the final page, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a phone number. Karen pulled out her phone and dialed. After several tense rings, a woman's voice answered, breathless with worry. When Karen introduced herself and mentioned Leo, the woman broke down in tears. It was his mother. She begged to know where he was, her voice trembling with desperation. Karen assured her that Leo was safe, now en route to the hospital. She gave the location, urging the mother to meet them there. Hanging up, Karen felt a fleeting sense of relief. But as she zipped the backpack shut, her eyes lingered on the dog, which stood rigid, ears pricked, staring into the shadows of the construction site. Karen's instincts bristled. The danger wasn't over. Karen slung the backpack over her shoulder, her eyes following the dog's tense posture. The animal growled low, staring toward the far end of the site. Karen adjusted her stance, her hand brushing the holster at her hip. Between the skeletal beams of the unfinished structure, a figure stood watching. The man's dark jacket and baseball cap masked much of his face, but his presence radiated unease. He lingered for only a moment before turning sharply and disappearing behind a row of parked cars. Karen's instincts screamed to chase him, but she hesitated. Leo was already on his way to the hospital, and she couldn't risk leaving the site unsecured. Still, she burned the man's image into her memory. Medium height, dark clothing, movements too casual to be innocent. She turned back to the rubble, her eyes scanning for anything he might have left behind. Near a pile of bricks, something caught her attention, a torn scrap of coarse fabric snagged on a rusty nail. She bagged it for evidence, her mind racing. The dog barked once, short and sharp, as if confirming her unease. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The bad men Leo spoke of were real, and they were closer than she had feared. The dog pawed insistently at a patch of ground near the plank. Karen knelt beside it, brushing away loose dirt until something metallic glinted in the sunlight. She pulled it free, a small, battered key with the number 312 etched into its side. It didn't belong to the construction site. Karen studied it, suspicion gnawing at her. A storage locker, perhaps, or a lockbox hidden somewhere in the city. Whatever it was, it might be the thread that tied this chaos together. She slipped it into an evidence bag. Her radio crackled. Dispatch confirmed Leo had arrived safely at the hospital and his mother was already there. Relief softened Karen's shoulders for a moment, but the tension never fully eased. She knew the boy's story of bad men was not a child's imagination. Karen stood, scanning the perimeter once more. The skeletal beams above cast long shadows across the ground, like bars of a cage. The sense of being watched crawled across her skin, prickling every nerve. The dog sat by her side now, panting lightly, its gaze fixed on the gate as though expecting something, or someone, to return. Karen exhaled, tightening her grip on the evidence bag. She had enough to start pulling threads, but the picture forming in her mind was dark, dangerous, and far from complete. Karen drove straight to City General, the dog curled quietly in the passenger seat. Her mind replayed Leo's weak words, "bad men," over and over, as though the phrase itself carried a weight heavier than any evidence bag. At the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Officers stood guard at the entrances while doctors worked on Leo. Through the glass, Karen spotted his mother, Sarah Evans, pacing in fear. When Karen approached, Sarah's relief was immediate, her trembling hands clutching at hope. In a quiet corner, Sarah admitted a painful truth. Her late husband had been tied to dangerous people, men who did not forgive betrayal. She had thought leaving him behind would keep Leo safe. Now, with Karen's evidence, the possibility that those men had found them was undeniable. Karen assured her that protection would be constant. Still, she felt the weight of Sarah's confession settle deep in her chest. This was no accident. Leo had been hunted. The dog suddenly barked, ears pricked, body stiff. It was staring through the hospital window toward the street. Karen followed its gaze, and her heart clenched. Across the road, a man in a dark jacket stood watching. The same posture, the same stillness, the same shadow she had seen at the construction site. Karen's breath slowed as she locked eyes with the man across the street. Even through the glare of sunlight, she recognized the posture, the same figure from the construction site. His cap pulled low, his face hidden, yet his stillness screamed intent. Before she could act, he turned and melted into the crowd, vanishing like smoke. Karen rushed outside, but the street was alive with movement, cars rolling by, pedestrians weaving together, voices blending into a wall of sound. The man was gone. Frustration bit at her. Whoever he was, he wanted her to know he was watching. It was a message more chilling than words. Back inside, she found Leo restless in his hospital bed, clutching the dog tightly. His wide eyes darted to the window, lips quivering as he whispered to his mother. Karen leaned close, urging him to speak. Leo's fragile voice trembled. He had seen the man too. The same one who chased him through the forest before he hid at the construction site. His description matched perfectly. Karen's jaw tightened. The bad men weren't shadows of a child's fear. They were real and bold enough to stalk a hospital. She raised her radio and ordered additional units. The hospital would be locked down. No one in, no one out. Until she understood what they wanted, Leo and his mother were targets, and now so was she. Karen's radio buzzed as she patrolled the hospital corridors. Dispatch confirmed what she had begun to suspect. The key she found at the construction site belonged to Bayview Storage, unit number 312. The account was registered under a fake name, paid in cash. Her pulse quickened. This was more than a random lead. It was a base of operations. Within the hour, Karen stood before the steel door of the unit, backed by 2 patrol cars and her loyal canine companion. The manager's hands shook as he turned the lock. The door rolled up with a screech, revealing a darkness thick with secrets. Karen stepped inside, flashlight cutting across the room. The beam illuminated shelves lined with electronic. Screens flickered to life, showing live feeds of different locations. Her stomach twisted as she recognized them. The construction site, the hospital, even Sarah's home. Pinned to a corkboard were photographs of Sarah, Leo, and Karen herself, taken from the shadows. Every step of their lives had been tracked, studied, and planned. In the corner sat a duffel bag. Karen unzipped it, revealing stacks of cash, fake passports, and a handgun. The scale of the operation was undeniable. This was organized crime at work, precise and merciless. Behind her, the dog growled low, staring at the open door of the unit. Karen turned, her heart leaping. A figure stood in the distance, watching. The same man. Still silent. Still unafraid. Karen bolted from the storage unit, her flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. The man in the dark jacket turned sharply, sprinting between the rows of units. His footsteps echoed, sharp and fast against the concrete. Karen shouted for him to stop, but he only ran faster. The dog leapt ahead, muscles coiled with instinct, its growl reverberating through the night. Karen's boots pounded against the ground, every stride fueled by adrenaline. The suspect vaulted over a low fence at the far edge of the facility, but the dog lunged and caught his sleeve. The man stumbled, crashing into the gravel, cursing as he tried to break free. Karen closed in, her breath heavy but steady, and in seconds had him pinned to the ground. Cuffs snapped around his wrists. She dragged him to his feet, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his cap. He refused to meet her gaze, lips pressed into a thin line. Karen demanded answers. Who was he? Why were they targeting Sarah and Leo? But he stayed silent, expression unreadable. His refusal was more dangerous than words. This was no small-time criminal. This was someone trained to protect bigger secret. As officers escorted him away, Karen glanced back at the storage unit filled with surveillance and cash. The network behind this was vast, and Leo's family had been marked from the very beginning. While the suspect sat in silence at the precinct, Karen returned to City General. The hospital corridors buzzed with unease, officers stationed at every corner. Sarah sat by Leo's bed, her hands trembling as she stroked his hair. The boy clung to the dog, refusing to let go. Karen crouched beside them, her tone steady but serious. She asked Leo again about the bad men. The boy's eyes watered as he spoke. He remembered being chased through the woods near his home, strangers shouting as they closed in. He ran until he found the construction site, but the planks collapsed when he tried to hide. Sarah listened, her face pale. With a shaky breath, she admitted the truth she had kept buried. Her ex-husband had been involved with dangerous people, smugglers who dealt in money, weapons, and secret. He tried to leave them, but men like that did not forgive betrayal. After his death, Sarah thought she and Leo were safe. But now, she realized they had only been living on borrowed time. Karen felt the pieces locking together, though the full picture remained hidden. The storage unit, the surveillance, the silent man, they were all threads tied to something larger, something organized. And if Sarah's confession was true, then Leo wasn't just a frightened child caught in the wrong place. He was the key to a vendetta, a weapon in someone else's unfinished war. The dog growled suddenly, ears pricked toward the window once more. Karen's hand instinctively went to her weapon. They were being watched again. Night fell over the hospital, but rest never came. The corridors were dim, the air heavy with tension. Karen remained posted near Leo's room, her notepad open, scribbling fragments of evidence. Each clue felt like a puzzle piece, yet the image remained incomplete. The dog suddenly stiffened, its ears sharp, its nose pressed to the glass window. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Karen's gaze followed. Across the street, parked beneath a flickering lamppost, sat a black SUV. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but its presence felt deliberate, like a predator waiting for its moment. Karen raised her radio, her voice clipped. Additional units were called to sweep the area. But when officers approached, the SUV pulled away, its tires screeching softly against the asphalt, vanishing into the night. Inside, Sarah's voice trembled as she asked Karen if they were safe. Karen answered with quiet confidence, though the weight pressing on her chest told another story. She had seen this pattern before. The men were probing, testing defenses, waiting for the moment when fear would break them down. Leo stirred in his bed, whispering to the dog, asking if Shadow could really keep him safe. The dog licked his cheek, its loyalty stronger than words. For the boy, it was enough comfort to close his eyes. Karen stayed awake, her gaze locked on the darkened window. The game had begun, and she knew the hunters would not stop until they claimed their prey. By morning, Karen's phone buzzed with news from her team. The safe inside Sarah's old house had been found. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, it stood untouched, its steel surface coated in dust. The new homeowners had resisted entry, but with a warrant in hand, the officers had forced it open. Inside lay a ledger. Its pages were filled with coded entries, cryptic numbers, and names tied to payments and shipments. At the center of it all was a single recurring alias: the broker. Karen read the report with narrowed eyes. The name had surfaced in whispers before, tied to smuggling rings that reached far beyond city lines. Whoever this broker was, he operated like a ghost, never directly present, always pulling strings from the shadows. At the hospital, Sarah listened in silence as Karen explained. Her face drained of color. She admitted her husband had often disappeared at night, always with excuses about work. She never knew the truth, but the safe proved the double life he had lived. Leo, sitting quietly with the dog, looked up with wide eyes. He asked if his father had been one of the bad men. Sarah pulled him close, her tears falling into his hair. She insisted his father loved him, but Karen could not ignore the truth. Love or not, the choices he had made had placed his family in the crosshairs of something merciless. Karen closed her notebook, the words heavy on her tongue. This was no longer about one frightened boy or his grieving mother. This was a war against a network that had already marked them all. The hospital had grown quieter with the new day, but Karen knew the silence was deceptive. She walked the halls with steady steps, noting every face, every movement. Officers guarded the entrances, yet her instincts told her the danger was closer than anyone believed. Her fears proved right when a folded piece of paper was found near the east loading dock. One of the guards handed it to her, his expression grim. The message was hastily scrawled in black ink, the words uneven but clear. "We know where the boy is. This isn't over." Karen's jaw tightened as she read the note aloud to her team. The intruders weren't guessing, they were taunting. They wanted her to feel the pressure to make mistakes. She returned to Sarah and Leo's room, hiding the note from their view. Sarah was already pale from sleeplessness, clutching her son as though he might vanish if she let go. Leo looked up from stroking the dog's fur, his small voice cutting through the stillness. He asked if the bad men would come for him again. Karen forced her tone calm, assuring him he was safe. Yet in her chest, unease gnawed. She had seen operations like this before. Probing, threatening, waiting for the chance to strike. As she stood by the window, watching the parking lot below, the dog growled softly at her feet. Its gaze was fixed beyond the glass, to where shadows stretched across the asphalt. Just before dawn, alarms pierced through the hospital corridors. Red lights flashed against the sterile walls as officers scrambled toward the east wing. Karen was already on her feet, weapon drawn, her heart pounding in her ears. At the loading dock, the fence had been cut clean through. Someone had tried to force entry under cover of night. The intruders hadn't made it inside, but they had left something behind. A message scrawled on a strip of cardboard, wedged into the broken gate. "You cannot protect him forever." Karen clenched the note in her hand. This was no idle threat. They were escalating, pushing harder with every move. She called for tighter lockdown protocols, restricted entry, doubled security, and constant patrols. Back in Leo's room, Sarah sat pale and trembling, clutching her son as the dog pressed close to them both. The boy's eyes widened when he saw the fear in his mother's face, and his voice came out in a whisper. He asked if the bad men were already inside. Karen knelt to meet his gaze. She told him firmly that they hadn't made it in, not this time, and they never would. But inside, she knew the truth. The walls of the hospital were not impenetrable. The enemy was patient. They would keep coming. And when they did, it would take everything Karen had to hold the line. Later that morning, Karen's phone buzzed with an update from her team at the old house. The safe had been cracked open fully, its contents carefully documented. She gathered in a quiet corner of the hospital to hear the report. The ledger was worse than she expected. It listed shipments, payments, and coded routes tied to smuggling operations across state lines. Every page revealed names, aliases that only criminals of a certain level used. And threaded throughout those entries was one title repeated like a curse: the broker. Karen's stomach tightened. She had heard the whispers, a ghost-like figure who orchestrated operations without ever appearing in person. Always someone else doing the dirty work. Always shadows, never light. The discovery rattled Sarah when Karen explained. She sat frozen, her voice breaking as she admitted her late husband had once spoken of someone who controlled everything from a distance. He had tried to walk away from that life, but walking away was never an option. Leo clung to his mother, stroking the dog's fur, his voice trembling. He asked if the bad men worked for the broker. Neither Karen nor Sarah answered. Their silence was enough. Karen closed her notebook with a snap. The ledger was the key. It exposed the network, but it also painted a target on everyone tied to it. Sarah, Leo, and now Karen herself. The broker would not stop until every loose end was erased. By afternoon, the hospital felt like a cage. Officers patrolled every hall, but Karen knew keeping Sarah and Leo here was only buying time. The broker's people had already tested the fences, left their notes, and circled the building like vultures. The next move would be bolder. Karen called her captain. With his approval, a relocation plan was set in motion. Sarah and Leo would be moved to a secure safe house at first light. To throw off any pursuers, a decoy convoy would leave at the same time, drawing attention away from the real transport. Sarah was terrified but resolute. She packed only a small bag, photos, a locket, a journal. Leo stayed close to the dog, whispering his fears into its fur. The animal wagged its tail, a living anchor in the storm around them. When dawn broke, the streets shimmered with golden light as the convoy rolled out. The decoy vehicle left first, escorted by officers. Minutes later, the true transport departed, a pair of unmarked cars leading and trailing the vehicle carrying Karen, Sarah, Leo, and the dog. For a time, the ride was smooth, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. Sarah stared out the window, her hands twisting in her lap. Leo leaned against Shadow, eyes heavy but restless. Then the radio crackled. One of the trailing officers reported a black SUV behind them, keeping its distance. The same vehicle from the hospital. Karen's jaw tightened. The hunters had found them. The convoy wound through quiet suburban streets, morning light spilling across rooftop. At first, the black SUV kept its distance, its tinted windows unreadable. But then, like a predator testing its prey, it crept closer. Karen's radio came alive with clipped voices. The rear escort confirmed the vehicle was tailing them, but when they attempted to slow and block, the SUV swerved aggressively, ramming the bumper of the trailing car. The officer's shout cut off in static as his vehicle spun off the road. Sarah gasped, clutching Leo against her chest. The boy buried his face into the dog's fur, his small body trembling. Shadow barked furiously, as if sensing the danger pressing closer. The lead driver swerved sharply into a side street on Karen's orders, tires squealing. The SUV followed without hesitation. Its engine roared, its bulk closing the gap with every second. Karen's hand hovered near her weapon, but she knew a firefight here would be chaos. They needed open ground, somewhere reinforcements could reach them. She grabbed the radio again, her voice steady but urgent, calling for immediate backup. The SUV lurched forward, bumping their rear bumper hard enough to jolt everyone inside. Sarah cried out, shielding Leo with her body. The boy whimpered, whispering that the bad men had found them. Karen's eyes locked on the mirror, her jaw tight. This was no test anymore. The hunt was on. The black SUV surged forward, pulling alongside the convoy with sudden force. The tinted window slid down just enough for a gloved hand to appear, gripping a weapon. Karen's pulse spiked. She shouted for the driver to cut left, and the vehicle swerved violently, the shot ringing out into empty air. Cars honked in the distance as bystanders scattered, but the streets cleared quickly, fear driving them away. The convoy accelerated through a narrow side road, the SUV pressing tight behind. Its bulk rammed the rear quarter, metal screeching, the impact throwing Sarah sideways into the seat. Leo screamed, clutching Shadow as the dog braced itself against the floorboards, barking with feral rage. Karen twisted in her seat, firing a warning shot through the back window. The sound cracked through the morning, and the SUV swerved briefly before regaining control. The lead escort shouted over the radio. Reinforcements were minutes away, but Karen knew minutes could be a lifetime. The SUV drew closer again, edging them toward a ditch. The driver gritted his teeth, forcing the car back to center, the tires screeching in protest. Then, as if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance. 2 patrol cars appeared from a side street, blocking the road ahead. The SUV braked hard, its tires smoking, before swerving down another street and vanishing from sight. The convoy slowed, battered but intact. Sarah's hands shook as she clung to her son, whispering his name over and over. Karen holstered her weapon, her eyes cold, her voice steady. They had survived this time. But the broker's men had sent a message. They would not stop until the family was theirs. The convoy left the chaos of the city behind, trading asphalt for winding rural roads. Hours later, they reached a secluded cabin hidden deep among dense trees. The safe house was modest. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small living space, but it was surrounded by patrols and cameras. The forest itself acted as another barrier, thick and quiet, every branch swaying in the wind like a silent guard. Sarah stepped inside first, her eyes darting nervously over the plain walls and narrow windows. Leo clung to her hand, shadow pressed close at his side. Karen followed, scanning each corner with trained eyes, ensuring the house was as secure as promised. Officers unpacked supplies and checked communications, their movements quick and efficient. The perimeter team settled in, rotating watch shifts through the night. On the surface, everything was controlled. But Sarah's unease never eased. She sat on the worn couch, clutching Leo close, whispering that everything would be fine. Yet her trembling hands betrayed her fear. The boy leaned against her, his gaze fixed on Shadow, who stood near the door, ears pricked, growling softly at the forest beyond. Karen crouched beside them, her tone steady. This place was safe, reinforced, guarded. But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. The broker's reach was wide, and his patience endless. The safe house was a refuge. But it was also a trap if discovered. And somewhere in the woods, unseen eyes might already be watching. The first night in the safe house was thick with silence. The forest pressed against the cabin like a living wall, the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. Officers patrolled with steady flashlights, their beams slicing through the dark, yet the air felt heavy with unseen eyes. Inside, Sarah tried to calm herself by tidying the kitchen, though every sound made her flinch. Leo lay curled on the couch with Shadow at his side, the dog's ears twitching at every creak of the cabin. Karen sat at the dining table, poring over the ledger, tracing lines of coded entries with her pen. Each one tied back to shipments, money, and the unseen hand of the broker. Near midnight, a guard knocked softly on the door. He reported movement in the treeline, faint and fleeting, but enough to raise alarm. Karen stepped outside into the cold air, her breath visible in the moonlight. She scanned the dark forest, its shadows thick, its silence unbroken. No shape, no footstep, just the weight of something waiting. Back inside, Sarah whispered that she could not sleep, her nerves stretched thin. Karen assured her this was normal, that fear was only proof of what was at stake. Leo stirred, his small voice rising in the quiet. He said he heard someone calling his name outside. Shadow growled then, low and guttural, pacing by the door with hackles raised. Karen's eyes narrowed. The hunters were probing again. Testing. Searching. And the forest was no longer empty. The night dragged on, heavy and restless. Karen remained awake, her gaze fixed on the windows while the others slept in uneasy fits. The forest beyond was cloaked in silence, yet every instinct told her it was alive with movement. At 2 a.m., the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then steadied again. Officers outside reported nothing unusual, but their voices carried a tension that Karen recognized. They felt it too. Shadow suddenly rose from the floor, ears pricked, growling at the door. His body stiffened, muscles coiled, as his nose pressed against the crack beneath the wood. Karen stood quickly, hand resting on her weapon. Then came the sound. Faint, deliberate footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. Slow. Patient. Measured. Karen raised her radio, whispering for the perimeter team to sweep the woods. The line crackled, but no reply came. She tried again. Still silence. Sarah stirred on the couch, eyes wide as she clutched Leo close. The boy trembled, whispering that the voices outside had returned, calling his name again. Karen moved to the window, her pulse steady, her eyes scanning the trees. Shadows shifted between the trunks, too large to be animals, too controlled to be chance. The hunters had found them. And this time, they were not leaving. The cabin walls seemed to tighten around them as the footsteps grew bolder. Karen motioned for Sarah to keep low, pressing Leo close against the couch. Shadow stood rigid at the door, teeth bared, growl deepening with every second. Then the first strike came. A loud crack echoed through the night as something heavy slammed against the back door. Officers rushed to respond, their shouts cutting through the stillness. Gunfire erupted, short and sharp, breaking the fragile silence of the woods. Karen gripped her weapon, heart pounding as she moved to the front windows. Figures darted between the trees, their masks blending with the shadows. They weren't random thugs. This was coordinated, precise. The broker's men had come in force. Sarah's voice trembled as she whispered Leo's name over and over, holding him so tightly his knuckles turned white. The boy buried his face into Shadow's fur, whispering that the bad men were here. The front window shattered, glass raining across the floor. Karen ducked low, firing back into the darkness. The intruders pulled back, regrouping, their shapes barely visible in the trees. But Karen knew this was only the beginning. The safe house had been discovered. The hunters had found their prey. And the first strike was only the opening move in a night that would test them all. The gunfire outside grew louder, echoing through the trees like rolling thunder. Karen crouched low, signaling the officers inside to cover the doors and windows. The walls shook as another impact rattled the back entrance. The intruders were no longer testing, they were forcing their way in. Shadow barked furiously, launching himself at the door as if to face the threat head-on. Leo clung to his mother, tears streaming down his face. Sarah's lips moved in silent prayer, her arms tightening around her son. Then came the splintering sound of wood. The back door burst open, a masked figure shoving through with a weapon raised. Karen reacted instantly, firing once, the intruder collapsing before he could advance. But more shadows poured in behind him, their movements quick and merciless. Officers engaged, the small cabin erupting into chaos. Bullets tore into the walls, splinters flying across the room. Karen pulled Sarah and Leo toward the corner, shielding them with her body while shouting for the dog to stay close. Shadow growled, lunging at another figure who crashed through the window, teeth sinking into his arm. The air was thick with smoke and panic. Karen's voice cut through it, sharp and commanding. Hold the line. But she knew the truth. The cabin would not hold forever. The broker's men had come prepared, and they would not stop until they had what they wanted. The cabin shook under the weight of the assault. Smoke curled from shattered windows, the smell of gunpowder choking the air. Officers fought with grit, but the intruders kept coming, forcing their way through every gap, every weakness. Karen fired steadily, her voice cutting through the chaos as she ordered her team to hold formation. But even with her control, the house was being swallowed inch by inch. In the madness, one masked figure broke through the rear hallway, slipping past the crossfire. His steps were fast, purposeful, and he headed straight for the corner where Sarah clutched Leo. The boy screamed, his small hands clawing at his mother as the man seized his arm and yanked him toward the door. Sarah lunged, her voice raw with desperation, but the intruder shoved her aside. Shadow leapt, teeth flashing, dragging the man down in a brutal snarl. Leo fell back into his mother's arms as Karen turned, her shot precise, striking the intruder before he could rise. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, broken only by Leo's sobs and Sarah's gasping breaths. Then, outside, came the blaring of sirens, reinforcements at last. The remaining attackers retreated into the forest, their shadows vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Karen stood in the smoke-filled room, her weapon still raised, her chest heaving. They had survived, but only barely. The broker's men had made their message clear. They were willing to take Leo by force, no matter the cost. The cabin was a ruin. Bullet holes scarred the walls, glass crunched underfoot, and the air carried the acrid bite of smoke and gunpowder. Officers moved quickly, tending to the wounded and securing the perimeter, their radios alive with clipped, urgent chatter. Sarah sat on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around Leo, rocking him back and forth as if to convince herself he was still there. The boy's sobs had softened to quiet whimpers, his face buried in Shadow's fur. The loyal dog stayed pressed against him, chest heaving, a faint limp in one paw but eyes fierce and alert. Karen lowered her weapon at last, her hands trembling though her face remained hard. She scanned the destruction, the shattered doors and windows, and knew the truth. This safe house was no longer safe. The broker's reach was longer than their defenses. She called her captain, her voice edged with frustration. Reinforcements had come too late. The broker's men had slipped back into the woods, leaving only chaos behind. Yet their attempt had revealed something important. They were desperate, reckless even. Whatever they wanted from Sarah and Leo, they were willing to risk open war to get it. As dawn broke, painting the forest in gray light, Karen stepped outside. The trees stood still, hiding the shadows that had attacked only hours before. She clenched her fists. This couldn't continue. Karen stood outside the shattered cabin as dawn burned away the night. The forest was silent again, but the silence felt wrong, like a predator waiting just beyond sight. She tightened her grip on the radio, her jaw set in grim determination. Inside, Sarah tended to Leo, who had finally drifted into exhausted sleep against Shadow's side. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she brushed dirt from her son's hair. When Karen entered, Sarah looked up with hollow eyes. She asked the question Karen had been dreading. How much longer could they run? Karen crouched beside her, her tone firm but steady. Running wasn't enough anymore. The broker's men would keep coming until there was nothing left to take. It was time to turn the hunt around. The officers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, but none argued. The evidence from the ledger, the surveillance unit, and the assault on the safe house all pointed to a single truth. This wasn't random intimidation. It was a campaign. Karen laid out the plan. Her team would strike the network itself, its warehouses, its hidden caches, its nerve centers. Cut the roots, and the tree would fall. But to do that, they needed precision, speed, and the will to risk everything. Sarah listened, her hand resting on Leo's shoulder. She whispered that she trusted Karen, but fear still shimmered in her eyes. She knew that if the fight escalated, the danger to her son would only grow. Karen stood, her decision carved into stone. The safe house would hold for now, but the next move was hers. The broker had stalked them long enough. Now she would become the hunter. The safe house was patched with plywood and reinforced locks, but the scars of the attack lingered in every corner. While Sarah and Leo rested, Karen gathered her team in the cramped kitchen, the ledger spread across the table. Each page was a puzzle of numbers, coded initials, and cryptic route. But the patterns were there. Shipments traced to warehouses in the industrial district. Payments flowing through shell companies. A chain of addresses that spread like veins across the city. One name kept surfacing among the entries: the broker. Never directly tied, always hidden behind layers of fronts and aliases, but his shadow was unmistakable. He was orchestrating everything, pulling strings while his soldiers did the dirty work. Karen circled 3 locations on the map. Each one was marked as a staging ground. If they could strike quickly, they might cripple the network before it regrouped. The risk was high. Sarah and Leo would need heavier protection here at the safe house while Karen led the raid. Sarah listened quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She said nothing, but her eyes spoke her fear. Every time Karen left, the threat of return grew heavier. Leo, clutching Shadow, whispered that he wanted the bad men to stop forever. His small voice carried a weight beyond his years. Karen promised him they would, but deep inside, she knew promises meant little until the broker himself was in chains. She folded the map, her decision made. The first raid would begin tonight. Night draped the industrial district in shadows, the air heavy with the scent of oil and rust. Karen crouched with her team behind a line of stacked shipping containers, her eyes fixed on the dimly lit warehouse ahead. A single bulb flickered above the side door, casting weak light onto the cracked concrete. The ledger had marked this place as a hub. If the broker's men were moving shipments, this was where the trail would lead. Karen raised her hand, signaling silence. The team adjusted their weapons, eyes locked, nerves taut like bowstrings. They moved low and fast, hugging the walls as they approached. The dog, Shadow, had insisted on following despite Karen's orders to stay back with Leo. Somehow, the animal had slipped into the convoy, its silent loyalty refusing to be left behind. Now it padded at Karen's side, alert and tense. At the door, Karen pressed her ear to the metal. Inside came muffled voices, sharp and purposeful, the shuffle of crates being moved. She gave the signal, and the breaching charge was set. The explosion tore through the silence, the door crashing inward. Her team surged through, weapons raised. The interior was chaos, rows of crates stacked high, armed men scrambling for cover. Gunfire erupted, flashes lighting the shadows. Karen dove behind a forklift, returning fire with precision. The air filled with the clang of ricochets, the shouts of men caught off guard. Shadow barked furiously, his growl echoing through the vast space. And there, at the far end of the warehouse, Karen spotted it, a corkboard lined with maps, photos, and coded note. Evidence. Proof of the network. But between her and that wall stood a squad of the broker's soldiers, already regrouping for a counterattack. The warehouse erupted in a storm of chaos. Bullets ripped through crates, splinters exploding into the air. Karen pressed against the cold steel of the forklift, her breath steady despite the roar around her. She signaled her team to flank left while she drew fire. She rose and fired 3 clean shots. One man dropped. Another scrambled for cover. The remaining soldiers shouted to each other in clipped, foreign phrases, their movements sharp and disciplined. These weren't simple thugs. They were trained, and they were buying time. Shadow darted between aisles, his growl a low thunder. One intruder lunged at him, but the dog sank its teeth deep, dragging the man down before an officer finished the job. Karen pushed forward, her boots crunching over shattered glass, her weapon flashing in precise bursts. Slowly, her team carved through the resistance, the noise fading to silence broken only by the crackle of a broken light overhead. Smoke hung in the air, thick and acrid. Karen advanced toward the corkboard she had spotted. Her eyes scanned the pinned maps, the photos, the coded note. One picture froze her cold. It was Leo, taken from a distance as he walked to school months ago. Another showed Sarah outside a grocery store. And in the corner, a grainy shot of Karen herself, leaving the precinct at night. The broker's men had been watching for far longer than she had imagined. The radio's warning sharpened the air like a blade. Reinforcements were coming, and the warehouse would soon be crawling with more of the broker's men. Karen scanned the corkboard one last time, her eyes locking on a small leather-bound notebook wedged between maps. She grabbed it, shoving it into her vest. Then she shouted the order. Pull back. Her team moved quickly, covering one another as they retreated through the aisles. Shadow bounded ahead, barking at every echo, his instincts guiding them toward the exit. The sound of engines roared outside, doors slamming, voices barking commands in the darkness. Karen reached the shattered entry door just as headlights cut across the lot. 3 SUVs skidded to a halt, armed men pouring out with weapons raised. Bullets sparked against the steel frames, forcing her team back inside. They needed another way out. Karen spotted a set of high windows above the loading bay. She ordered the team to set a charge on the bay doors, creating a diversion. The explosion rocked the building, sending smoke and fire into the night. As the intruders rushed toward the blast, Karen led her group up a metal staircase and through the windows, dropping hard onto the asphalt outside. Engines roared again as 2 patrol cars screeched into the lot, reinforcements at last. Officers opened fire, buying Karen and her team precious seconds. They scrambled into their vehicles, Shadow leaping in after them as bullets pinged off the doors. As they sped away, Karen clutched the notebook tight against her chest. Inside those pages might be the broker's secret, but the cost of retrieving it had only just begun. The convoy sped through the empty streets, engines growling in the night. Karen sat in the back seat, the leather-bound notebook heavy in her hands. Its cover was scuffed, edges frayed, as though it had been handled 1,000 times. She opened it cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting across cramped handwriting. Page after page was filled with coded entries, initials paired with numbers, dates, and locations. But unlike the ledger, this notebook contained something far more direct. Names. Politicians, businessmen, shipping magnates. Each one linked to shipments and payoff. Some were circled, others crossed out. And in the margins, scrawled in sharp ink, was a single phrase repeated over and over. Reclamation Protocol. Karen's chest tightened. She had heard whispers of it before. A brutal contingency plan used by smuggling rings to silence anyone tied to their operations. Witnesses, informants, even law enforcement. No one was off limits. She turned another page and froze. A photograph was tucked between the sheets. Sarah and Leo, sitting together at a park bench. The image had been taken from a distance, months earlier. Their faces calm, unaware of the danger that had already closed in around them. Karen clenched her fist. The broker wasn't just threatening them. He had been planning their capture for a long time. Outside, the sirens of escort cars wailed through the night. But inside the vehicle, silence hung heavy. The notebook was not just evidence, it was a death list. And Sarah and Leo were at the very top. Back at the safe house, the night was restless. The forest lay still, but Sarah could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes lingered between the trees. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch, every gust of wind sent her heart racing. Leo slept fitfully on the couch, Shadow curled protectively at his side. The dog's ears twitched at every sound, his body tense, as though he too felt the weight of the unseen threat. Sarah stroked Leo's hair, whispering softly that he was safe, though her voice trembled with doubt. An officer knocked gently, giving her a reassuring nod. The perimeter was secure, he said, no movement detected. But Sarah could see the unease in his eyes, the subtle tension in his posture. They all knew the broker's men would not stay away for long. Alone again, she walked to the window and peered into the darkness. For a moment she thought she saw something, just a flicker, a shadow shifting between the trees. Her breath caught, and her hand tightened on the curtain. But when she blinked, it was gone. Behind her, Leo stirred in his sleep. He murmured that the bad men were coming back, his words slurred with dreams. Shadow raised his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah's pulse hammered as she pulled the curtains shut. She prayed Karen would return soon, because the silence outside felt less like peace, and more like the calm before another storm. Karen sat in the precinct's operations room, the notebook spread across the table under a harsh lamp. Around her, officers pored over maps and files, tracing every line, every coded entry. The room hummed with urgency, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue. The notebook was a roadmap of corruption. Routes across state lines, payments that stretched into millions, and names of men who held power in boardrooms as well as back alleys. But one detail stood out above all the others, a compound on the city's outskirts, marked again and again in the note. A hub. A nerve center. Karen leaned over the map, her finger pressing against the location. This was it. The broker's stronghold. The place where shipments were coordinated, money was laundered, and orders were given. If they struck here, they could cut the head off the serpent. Her captain hesitated, warning her of the risk. The compound would be fortified, guarded, and crawling with soldiers. But Karen's voice was firm. Waiting only gave the broker more time to regroup, more time to send his men after Sarah and Leo. Her decision was final. They would raid the compound at nightfall. As the team prepared, Karen's mind drifted briefly to the safe house. She pictured Sarah clutching Leo, Shadow standing guard with teeth bared at the door. They were holding on, but they couldn't hold forever. Karen's jaw set with grim resolve. This was the moment. Either she would end the broker's reign, or he would come for them all. The safe house lay restless, but at the precinct, the air crackled with preparation. Karen stood before a wall of maps and photographs, her voice sharp and steady as she briefed the assembled team. The compound sat on the city's edge, hidden behind high fences and rows of warehouses. Guards patrolled in shifts, their positions mapped from surveillance drones. Trucks moved in and out at odd hours, likely carrying shipments the ledger had hinted at. Karen divided the teams. Alpha would breach the front gate. Bravo would secure the perimeter, cutting off escape routes. Charlie would follow her inside to the server room, where the broker's records were stored. Every man and woman in the room knew the risk. The compound was a fortress, and the broker had already shown he would kill without hesitation. But no one flinched. The assault was their only chance to dismantle the network once and for all. As the meeting ended, Karen lingered by the table. Her hand rested on the notebook, its pages spread open to the list of names and shipments. She traced her finger over the words "Reclamation Protocol," the phrase like a shadow whispering of violence yet to come. She exhaled, her resolve hardening. Sarah and Leo were counting on her. Every innocent caught in the broker's web was counting on her. At sundown, they would move. The compound would burn. And the broker would finally stand in the light. Darkness cloaked the outskirts of the city, the compound rising like a fortress against the horizon. Floodlights swept the grounds, their beams cutting across the high fence crowned with barbed wire. The faint hum of generators carried on the cold wind, mingling with the crunch of boots as Karen and her team advanced. They moved in silence, each step rehearsed, each breath measured. The convoy had stopped a mile back, engines killed to avoid detection. Now, the officers crept forward through the weeds and shadows, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the prize ahead. Karen crouched at a ridge overlooking the compound, studying the patrols. Guards paced in pairs, rifles slung, their silhouettes framed by the glow of sodium lights. Trucks idled near a loading dock, workers moving crates into the warehouses. The scale of the operation was undeniable. This was no small cell. It was the broker's kingdom. She raised her hand, signaling her teams. Alpha peeled off to the left, moving to breach the front gate. Bravo slid right, disappearing into the tree line to cut off escape route. Karen remained with Charlie, her eyes locked on a side entrance that would lead to the server room. Beside her, Shadow crouched low, his body tense, ears pricked. The dog had refused to be left behind again, and Karen hadn't fought him this time. His instincts had saved lives before. Tonight, she trusted they would again. The final radio check crackled softly in her ear. All teams were in position. The night shattered with a thunderous explosion. Team Alpha's charges blew the front gate wide open, metal twisting into the air as fire lit the compound in a blinding flash. Shouts erupted from inside, guards scrambling in panic, rifles raised, floodlights jerking wildly to find the intruders. Gunfire cracked through the darkness, sharp and unrelenting. Bravo's team engaged from the perimeter, cutting off fleeing trucks with bursts of suppressive fire. Smoke rolled across the lot, cloaking everything in chaos. Karen surged forward with Team Charlie, Shadow at her side, their movements swift and precise. She pushed through the confusion, cutting across the compound's flank toward the side entrance. The heavy steel door resisted for only a second before her breachers charged tore it inward. Inside, the air was thick with oil and dust, the corridors narrow and dim. Echoes of the firefight outside thundered through the walls, but Karen kept moving. Every step carried her closer to the server room, the heart of the broker's empire. A guard appeared at the corner, weapon raised. Karen fired first, the shot echoing like thunder in the cramped hallway. Shadow growled low, tugging her toward the next turn, his instincts guiding them through the labyrinth of steel and concrete. Behind her, officers moved in disciplined formation, securing each room with swift precision. The compound trembled under the siege, but Karen knew the worst was still ahead. The corridor bent sharply, leading to a reinforced steel door. Karen's team stacked against the wall, their breaths steady, weapons raised. A keypad glowed faintly beside the frame, its screen blinking red. This was it, the server room. The breacher set the charge. Karen counted down on her fingers. 3, 2, 1. The blast ripped the lock apart, the door swinging wide in a cloud of smoke. Inside, rows of humming servers bathed the room in a cold blue glow. Cables ran across the floor like veins, monitors flickering with streams of encrypted data. This was the broker's brain, the vault of his empire. Karen moved quickly, ordering her tech specialist to extract everything. A portable drive was plugged in, files spilling across the screen in rapid bursts. Names, accounts, routes. Enough to dismantle the network brick by brick. But the servers weren't unguarded. From a hidden corner, shots rang out. Bullets sparked against metal as armed men surged forward. Karen dropped to one knee, returning fire with precision. Shadow lunged, pulling one of the attackers to the ground, his snarls echoing off steel. The fight was brutal, close, and loud. When it ended, the servers still hummed, but the floor was littered with silence and bodies. The tech's voice cut through the ringing in Karen's ears. Transfer complete. But his tone carried a warning. A secondary program had been triggered, something called Reclamation Protocol. The servers were beginning to wipe themselves clean. Karen's stomach dropped. The broker knew they were here. And somewhere beyond these walls, he was already preparing his next move. Karen gathered the extracted drive, her pulse thundering. The servers around her blinked wildly, their data streams collapsing one by one as the reclamation protocol consumed them. She ordered her team to fall back, Shadow pressing close at her side. They raced through the corridors, the compound trembling with chaos. Explosions rattled the walls as the broker's men fought desperately to stall the raid. But every corner carried a new danger, every shadow a threat. At the main stairwell, the trap was sprung. A wall of gunfire erupted, forcing Karen and her team into cover. The air filled with sparks and smoke. From above, a calm voice cut through the din, cold and mocking. So persistent, detective. But this is where it ends. The broker stepped into the light at last. Tall, sharp-eyed, his dark coat flowing like a shadow made flesh. He watched her with unsettling calm, as though every move had been part of his design. Karen rose from cover, weapon trained on him. Her voice was iron. It ends tonight. The standoff held for a breath that felt like eternity. Then chaos exploded. The broker's guards surged forward, but Karen's team met them head-on. The corridors lit with muzzle flashes, each shot echoing like thunder. Karen pressed forward, her eyes never leaving the broker. He fired once, the bullet grazing her arm, but she didn't falter. Step by step, she closed the gap. Shadow lunged, tearing into one of the guards who tried to flank her, giving her the opening she needed. She fired, once clean and precise. The broker staggered, shock flickering across his face before he fell. His empire, built on shadows and fear, crumbled with him. Silence fell at last. Officers secured the compound, the servers and files now in their hands. The network would collapse, its roots torn from the ground. Back at the safe house, Sarah wept with relief when Karen returned. Leo rushed forward, Shadow bounding after him, the boy's small arms wrapping tightly around the dog's neck. For the first time in days, his smile was real. Karen stood at the doorway, exhaustion pressing heavy on her shoulders. But in her heart she felt the weight lift. They had survived. The broker's grip was broken. The war was not over, there would always be more battles, more shadows to face. But tonight one family was safe. And that was enough.